Welcome to the Bigger Box, I'm Isabella. Regarding the previous road test video, I believe everyone has a clear idea of who is stronger and who is weaker. This time, we'll bring in the life and death moments on the road directly into the test field. Facing these scenarios, will the system be so overwhelmed that it malfunctions, and which vehicle can calmly break the deadlock? The 9-vehicle extreme scenario test of Bigger Box begins now. In this test, we have 8 items which are divided into 2 categories: tests related to driving safety and scenario that test system efficiency. Safety tests are extremely challenging. For example, there are scenarios like non-motorized vehicle crossing diagonally, objects being thrown from the front vehicle, and fallen dummy at night. And let's first take a look at test result. First, let's take a look at the situation about a non-motorized vehicle crossing diagonally. Have the electric bag stand by in place, and at the moment when the test vehicle approached, suddenly cut diagonally across at the 30-degree angle. For one thing, the transition from stationary to dynamic is too sudden, and the system does not have time to prejudge its trajectory. For another, the 30-degree diagonal angle is tricky, and it is easily missed by the vehicle's blind spots or the perception algorithm. Our test speed is 65 km/h, which is generally also the maximum speed limit on urban roads. The results are only 2 taps, collision and no collision. The test results are as follows. The luxeed R7 encountered a minor issue. When the dummy approached, it slightly decelerated. After the dummy entered the lane, the target on SR turned right, and AEB was also triggered. As a result, it ran over the belt while braking, causing the dummy to get stuck. After carefully checking the materials and the backend data, we determined that the luxeed R7 could have avoided the collision, and the result is valid. Subsequently, we will also upgrade the equipment to avoid such a situation. The performance of Xiaomi voyah 7 in this scenario was quite surprising. It recognized the target early and almost at the same time that the dummy started to cross diagonally. The system starting to prompt "please braking immediately, collision risks exist," ultimately successfully avoiding a collision.
请立即刹车，存在碰撞风险，应控制车辆。
When the voyah 3 Plus detects a dummy, it directly triggers AEB to brake to a stop, and surprisingly, the NOA function does not exist after AEB successfully avoids danger. After checking the past cars, let's take a look at the car that didn't pass and see how they perform respectively. For Blue Mountain and the IMLS6, the SR shows dummy models, but the system is not reaction or response. Xiaopeng G7 spotted the dummy early but did not decelerate defensively, and it was too late to brake when the dummy entered the lane. Onvo S60 slowed down as soon as the dummy moves, but unfortunately, the braking force is too weak, and even when AEB is triggered, it's useless. BYD handheld decelerated in advance, but its path overlapped with that of the non-motorized vehicle, and it still failed to avoid collision. The zeekr 007 GT has a stronger braking force with a greater deceleration amplitude than the BYD handheld, but it's also pressed against the belt. After our verification, we determined that the system can avoid collisions. Everyone must have seen this kind of scene on the highway. We recreate such a scenario using drop cardboard box. Cardboard box have no metallic reflection, no regular outlines, and are constantly moving, which also pose a huge challenge to system reaction and recognition. Do you think these 9 cars can complete the task? The answer is that all 9 cars have been wiped out. After the IML6 activated its function, due to the influence of the vehicle in front, its speed did not reach 65 km/h. However, after the cardboard box failed, instead of braking, it even stepped on the accelerator. The luxeed R7 voyah 3 Plus also crashed. If it were a static cardboard box, Huawei ADAS match still worked, but dynamic, erratically floating irregular obstacle combined with extremely short reaction time posed challenging even for Huawei. The Blue Mountain also accelerates after the cardboard box fall off. BYD hand and onvo X60 did not respond at all during the entire process and crashed head-on. The xpeng G7 is a bit special. Although the SR interface rendered the model, there was no warning and braking, and it still crashed in the end. Xiaomi voyah 7 and the zeekr 007 GT have some surprises, but not many. After the cardboard box failed, the system issued a warning on voyah 7. Although the SR interface did not render the obstacle, there was a prompt to brake immediately, and indeed there was a braking action, but the trajectory of the cardboard box could not be determined, and ultimately a collision still occurred. The zeekr 007 GT also cleared. When the cardboard box was falling and moving, the system did not respond, but when the cardboard box was about to come to a stop, the path was planned to detour, but the detour direction was not very reasonable. And finally, a collision also occurred. To be honest, this result was within my expectation. Although assistant driving has become increasingly powerful, it still struggled when facing with dynamic, non-standard objects, so drivers need to pay more attention to road conditions. And next, let's take a look at the scenario of the dog crossing at night. Still under low light conditions, can night car handle it? Only 3 out of the 9 vehicles can handle the situation. The Way Blue Mountain completely failed to recognize or issue a warning for a prompt dog crossing the road and drove straight through. However, due to a mistake by our driver is not to turn on the high beams, the result was invalidated. The IML6 also ignored the dog and finally collisions. BYD hand L is even more exaggerated than the first two, and actually started to accelerate after the dog appears. xpeng G7 rendered the model of the prompt dog on the SR interface, but there was a bit of the delay. It neither accelerated nor decelerated and drove straight through. The onvo X60 performs slightly better in this scenario. Although the dog model cannot be seen on the SR interface, there's at least a deceleration action. The final result is collision. On the SR interface of the voyah 3 Plus, the model of the dog can be clearly seen, as well as the action of the dog crossing, but the braking amplitude is very small. The system issued a warning sound, and the result was still a collision. The Xiaomi voyah 7 detected a dog crossing and started to decelerate, successfully avoiding a collision without the function exceeding. The zeekr 007 GT decelerates in advance and directly triggered AB after detecting a dog crossing the path, which has indeed made great progress compared to the previous version. The performance of luxeed R7 is the best in this scenario. The SR interface rendered the model of the animal, and when the dog crossed, it directly triggered AB, finally coming to a stop in front of the dog to avoid a collision, while the function remained intact, and it is amazing. Since dynamic scenes are too difficult, let's try static one. A fallen dummy under low light conditions. And this scene reminds me of a drunk lying on the side of the road. Most cars have successfully passed this time. Although it was a low light environment, the results are not strongly correctly with a presence or absence of LiDAR. It still depends on the overall capabilities of system. The onvo X60, due to the speed limit on the seat, could only maintain a speed of 50 km/h, but this didn't affect the final outcome. It did not slow down and warning, and completely ignored the fallen dummy running over it. Meanwhile, the xpeng G7, which also no LiDAR, performed better than the onvo. After detecting the fallen dummy, it begins to decelerate and triggered an evasive maneuvers, successfully avoiding a collision. The IMLS6 also did not perform any deceleration or warning action. Looking at the BYD hand L again, although there was a slight deceleration, there was no warning or braking, and it finally crashed straight into it. After detecting the dummy on the ground, zeekr decelerated in advance. The system prompt to take over, accompanied by an alarm sound, and also triggered a detour. This performance is indeed quite good. The Xiaomi voyah 7 also performed excellently, decelerating in advance, triggered a detour, slightly accelerating after the detour, and then returned to the original lane. The performance of the luxeed R7 and the voyah 3 Plus is extremely similar. After all, they are both from the Huawei ecosystem. They can identify the fallen dummy, bypass it, and the overall performance is smoothly. But the Voyah 3 Plus is better, with the overall speed fluctuation not even exceeding 3 km/h. Cone barriers are also regular obstacles that the system has been specifically trained for. But the combination of the night and the fallen becomes a new challenge. It may seem simple, but after the cone fails, it highly decreases, and the reflective effect at night weakens, requiring higher precision from the perception system. How will night vehicle handle this? And let's take a look at the results. First, let's look at the onvo S60. It can only recognize the upright traffic cone on the far right side of the road and has absolutely no reaction to the fallen traffic cone, no deceleration, no warning, and even quietly accelerates. Although the IML S6 decelerates, it unexpectedly circled around the upright cone barrier on the far right. I really don't understand this maneuver. BYD handheld also failing to recognize the fallen traffic cone at all, neither decelerating nor issuing a warning. In the end, we had no choice but to intervene manually to avoid a collision. In this scenario, the xpeng G7 performed better than the onvo S60. It started planning a detour early in its driving path and decelerates accordingly. Although the specific model is rendered, it has no flaw in terms of scenario handles. Zeekr 007 GT performs well and has a reasonable detour. Xiaomi voyah 7, luxeed R7, and voyah 3 Plus all behave the same way, first decelerating and then trigger a detour. The luxeed R7 and the voyah 3 Plus having relatively small speed fluctuations. Someone may have noticed why the Blue Mountain was absent from the two scenarios mentioned above. We'd like to apologize here, we lost the Blue Mountain's video materials. After reviewing the safety assessments, let's take a look at the scenario that tests the efficiency of each system. Efficiency is one of the most important factors determining the usage rate and takeover rate of assistant driving. The scenarios we have set up including get cone barrier, motor barrier limit the width, and the accident vehicle is occupying the space. We divided efficiency performance into 3 levels, S, A, and B. The criteria are simple and straightforward, easy to understand. And let's first look at the total score. Get cone barrier are commonly seen in construction scenarios, which is quite a test of the basic skills of assistant driving. After all, the system have received specialized training for obstacles like cones. We will uniformly test at a common speed of 65 km/h to see who can achieve a smooth passage. First, let's look at the onvo S60. Due to the speed limit reason, the speed can only be maintained at 50 km/h. Initially, after detecting the cone barriers, the path planning had clearly provided a detour plane, accompanied by a deceleration action. However, as it approached the cones, the path reverted back to the original lane, and finally it got stuck in place. After detecting the cone barriers, the BYD handheld system begins to decelerate and provide a test prompt. Caution, construction ahead. However, it didn't start to sway from side to side, although it did manage to detour around the cone in the end. Why did it even turn on its turn signals? We can only say that there is still a lot of room for improvement. Although the overall planning of Xiaomi voyah 7 was sound and it ultimately succeeded, it was not very smooth. After the zeekr 007 GT detected the cone barriers, it issues a voice prompt to be cautious of construction work, accompanied by an alarm sound. Strangely, the path planning only started to detour when approaching the cones. Although the vehicle did pass through this scenario smoothly in the end, and it seems to react half a beat slower. After the IML6 detected the cone barriers, it immediately started to decelerate, although it also detoured around the cone when approaching it. The IML6 changing lanes first and then turning on the turn signal is a bit dangerous. After detecting the cone barriers, the voyah 3 Plus slightly decelerates, and then immediately plans a detour, accelerating while bypassing. The luxeed R7 performs better than the voyah 3 Plus. Without hesitation, starting to plan a detour as soon as it detects the cone with speed fluctuation not exceeding 6 km/h, and perform best in this scenario. After xpeng G7 detects the traffic cones, its pause planning also detected by Boston, but the speed fluctuation is still greater compared to that of the IMLS6 and the voyah 3 Plus, with an up and down fluctuation of 38 km/h. Way Blue Mountain has already recognized the obstacle. However, the detour timing is slightly late. After looking at the relatively common scenario above, let's move on to the more challenging one, the width limit scenario. We use water barriers and traffic cone to occupy all lanes, leaving only a 2.5-meter wide passage. Facing this narrow passage scenario, the speed remains 65 km/h. Guess who performed better? The Way Blue Mountain performed poorly. After a slight deceleration, it still rushed forward at a speed of 60 km/h. After colliding with an obstacle, it prompted the driver to take over.
绝对是撞了。
The IMLS6 is directly stuck in place, and the SR interface has not even rendered these regular obstacles yet. After the xpeng G7 decelerated and tried to detour, the navigation light started to dance directly and even planned a route outside the path. BYD handheld first decelerate slightly, then significantly decelerate to 0 km/h after approaching the obstacle, and finally got stuck in front of the obstacle. Onvo X60 can only reach 50 km/h. Due to speed limited, obstacle can be seen from the SR interface, but why does it only slow down after passing them? Now let's take a look at the two contestants who received an A. After Xiaomi Vayu 7 detected an obstacle, its first attempt to change lanes to bypass it. After finding that it couldn't bypass, it continues moving forward, got stuck between the obstacles, hesitated for a while, and then managed to pass through with difficulty. Although the zeekr 007 GT can pass, its overall performance is too sluggish. First, it prompts the driver to pay attention to controlling the vehicle. And then, after the speed dropped to 0 km/h, it prompts for manual lane change. After the system determines that there is a space to pass, it accelerates on its own to pass.
卡住了。
Looking at the Luxeed R7 again, it immediately decelerates after detecting an obstacle, with no deviation in the overall path planning. When approaching the water barriers, its speed dropped to 20 km/h to pass through, and its performance remained quite stable. When approaching the water barriers, the voyah 3 Plus is control the distance through slight steering wheel adjustment and finally pass smoothly. What if the vehicle in front stopped directly in the middle of the lane, completely blocking the passage? In fact, this scenario is quite common at many intersections, and it is still quite challenging for the system to determine whether it is an accident or waiting to turn right. In this case, detouring is the optimal solution, but can 9 cars figure it out? And let's directly look at the results. The Way Blue Mountain started to decelerate continuously after detecting an obstacle vehicle until it stopped behind the obstacle vehicle. The onvo X60 can only travel at a speed below 50 km/h due to speed limit issues and is also lagging behind the obstacle vehicle. After the IMLS6 detected an obstacle vehicle, it started to decelerate. I thought it was going to detour, but it still stopped behind the obstacle vehicle. Xiaomi Vayu 7, BYD handheld, and the zeekr 007 GT all performed well in this scenario, decelerating, detouring, and then returning to the original lane. The overall detour planning of the xpeng G7 was relatively late, but unfortunately there was no lag, so it is also get an S. There was a small mistake here. The obstacle vehicle forgot to turn on the hazard lights, but it did not affect the result, and the detour was successful. Both the Voyah 3 Plus and the luxeed R7 performed very smoothly. They detoured first and then returned to the original lane. The speed fluctuation of the Voyah 3 Plus didn't even exceed 3 km/h. After watching the actual test of these 3 efficiency scenarios, everyone should be able to identify a commonality. For conventional obstacles such as cone barriers, water barriers, and a vehicle, all 9 models can basically recognize them and will also take deceleration actions. However, what truly sets them apart is the subsequent path planning and response strategies. Some models can smoothly bypass obstacles, while others are laggy and hesitant. From non-motorized vehicle crossing diagonally to the collective failure in the cardboard box scenario. And finally, to the daily efficiency scenario, we only focus on 2 core issues. Can it handle the bottom line when danger comes? Can it truly provide peace of mind during daily driving? As we can see from the performance table, no single vehicle can handle all scenarios, whether it's a multi-sensor fusion solution or a vision-based solution, and all of them have more or less unsolved problems. At this stage, assistant driving is always just assistance and cannot allow you to completely be a hands-off driver. You can relax your hands, but your eyes must stay focused on the road conditions, and the dangers on the road do not follow our exam syllabus. Alright, that's all for this episode of Bigger Box. Which car's performance surprised you the most? Feel free to leave the comments in the comment section to discuss, and we will see you next time.